Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. It's good to be with you again. It's been a while, huh?
Yeah, it's been almost a month, I think, and various things going on in my life, traveling a little bit, and 50th year reunion, my high school reunion, actually, and some medical issues with my wife, and so on and so forth, and just the usual workload, and it's just been difficult. But I know there are a lot of people that listen to our discussions, Daniel, and I should say really more the insights that you bring. And so I'd like to continue doing this if time permits from your side as well as mine. So I'd like to just perhaps get an update on some of the things we have, we've not really talked about because we've not been together for so long. But tell us a little bit about where does the Ukrainian conflict stand now?
Well, it's sort of in an impasse, although this past week or so, a couple of interesting things have happened. There was an amendment to an appropriations bill in the House, and what it did is it prohibited any funds being spent to train a group in Ukraine called the Azov Battalion. And I think we may have talked about them before, Jay. This is a kind of volunteer militia that's tied to the National Guard, but they're the ones that are wearing the SS things on their hat, and they're being photographed doing the Hitler salutes.
Yeah.
So they've really embraced this neo-Nazi ideology. And if you remember back when people were warning, and this is a year ago, when they were warning that there are Nazis involved in this coup in Ukraine, they were just counted as conspiracy theorists and kooks and Putin's stooges and that sort of thing. So now these people have gotten a bit of a justified because the House has voted that these groups can't be trained. So on one hand, I guess there's some satisfaction to be had in recognizing that the House at least sees that some of these wonderful people involved in this coup in Ukraine are not as lily white as they're portrayed in the U.S. But and I did a little episode of the Liberty Report with Dr. Paul this week about it. And one of the things that I pointed out, though, is in a way this is kind of a fig leaf, because Congress then will pat itself on the back that it's prevented money from going to these bad guys. And Dr. Paul pointed out, it reminds you of Syria, where they were saying the same things. Oh, we're not going to give any money to Al-Qaeda or ISIS,
Yeah.
And next thing you know, they've got all of these amazing American weapons, whether they were provided explicitly by the United States or whether the guys that they provided them to turned and ran like they did in Iraq. That's beside the point. These guys still ended up with the weapons. So the problem is the policy. It's not these tinkering around the edges that this one group is not so nice, and so they won't get any of the good guns.
Right. So, well, to what extent were these Nazis used in the overthrow in the Ukraine to start with by our people?
That's a good question, Jay, and I don't know that anyone knows specifically what contacts they may have had with the U.S. government, but we do know that toward the end, when things weren't working with these peaceful protests, they became incredibly violent, and we all saw videos. I guess everyone but Victoria Nuland saw the videos of the police being beaten up by the protesters and all of this horrible violence against the police as well. And these were these kinds of groups, the Azov types, the Right Sector is another group like that. But even more importantly, in the crackdown in eastern Ukraine, these are the groups that have been used extensively to terrorize the local populations, who are guilty of nothing but simply not wanting to be part of Ukraine anymore. They don't want to be part of a country that has been overthrown undemocratically. So they want to secede. So their punishment for that is to have these Nazi thugs running around beating up on civilians. So that's where they've really done the most damage, I think.
All right. So the Congress voted to try to, or at least not to reward those guys. But I mean, how real is that, and how effective will that be, I wonder?
Yeah, money is fungible, and so are weapons.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
This is the core, and it's not just this one group. They basically, what I think, my theory is, I think that Congress would like to be able to point out that, look, there were a couple of bad apples, and we took care of the problem.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, many of these people with this ideology are in Parliament, and even you and I think this ideology is absolutely abhorrent and disgusting, but that in and of itself is not the problem. The problem, from our perspective, is the interventionism and the U.S. support for anyone, even if they were all Boy Scouts. So it's kind of beside the point. And some people, I think, get a little bit too obsessed with the fact that these guys have got some really disgusting views, and they need to step back and look at the big picture, which is that we shouldn't be doing this at all anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, for public consumption, then the congressman can go to their constituents and say, look, what a good citizen I am. I'm standing up for American democracy and for the Constitution, and I'm really on the right side of this thing, never really looking at the reason we have a problem over there to start with, and then just blame Putin, of course, for the whole thing.
Well, that's always the default, and the other thing that happened in Ukraine is that, if you're in the region, really, is that the U.S. Through NATO announced that it was considering permanently stationing several thousand, I think 5,000 U.S. troops and an undetermined amount of heavy weaponry in the Baltics, literally on Russia's border.
Yeah.
And this is something that would violate a 1997 agreement between NATO and Russia, that if the Baltics were allowed to join NATO, at least NATO would not put troops and heavy equipment right there on Russia's border. So this is a violation of that. And you'll appreciate this, Jay, when they announced this, and Putin responded saying, well, we will have to move some of our military as well. He was accused of being aggressive, but he's the one who's moving his military within his own country.
Yeah.
Somehow you're not even allowed
It's incredible.
To move within your own country.
Yeah, it is really incredible how somehow we're brainwashed to look at things that way. And I just keep thinking, what would happen if on the Mexican border there were troops, Russian troops for some reason, or Chinese troops for some reason, that were threatening to come into our country, and or just sitting there, we would be mad as hell. So I mean,
it's not defending Putin to recognize the absurdity of NATO's side. They actually had the gall. I think Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, I think it was him, accused the Russians of saber rattling, in just responding to the fact that NATO is going to put troops right up on Russia's soil practically.
Right.
When Russia complains, they're accused of saber rattling.
Yeah, it's the psychological dynamic of projection, I guess. You tease or get someone else mad, and then they strike at you. And anyway,
but it isn't funny, Jay. Just one final little point.
Sure.
The thing is, I'm laughing, but it's not funny. This is incredibly dangerous brinksmanship.
Yes.
And wars through history have been started by mistake, by a slip, by a misunderstanding, and this just makes that all the more likely when you keep pushing. I don't believe NATO wants war with Russia, but I think they are overconfident and they think they can continue to push without any pushback, and they think they can continue to kind of blow hot air about it, and it just makes for an incredibly and unnecessarily incredibly dangerous situation.
Well, certainly the neocons, many of them believe that we probably can prevail in a hot war because we have such fantastic technology and so forth. So I imagine that's sort of the impression I get. But it seems to me the bigger picture has everything to do with power, domination, and money and wealth, and trying to gain whatever you can for yourself. Not the American people, but the ruling elite that are trying to keep. I keep coming back, Daniel, to the viability of the current monetary system, the petrodollar, and the need for the United States or NATO to control the monetary system, and that is based on the petrodollar ever since Nixon took us off the gold standard. So we see you and I were talking about, I think the last time we spoke, perhaps about Macedonia, and now Greece comes into the picture as well. Greece is talking to Putin about a gas pipeline, and that's part of the topic in Macedonia. I believe the Macedonian government agreed to allow a pipeline to go through there and into Turkey. What's going on in Macedonia? That looked like a place that could heat up and get pretty nasty too, but what's the latest there?
Well, I think we talked about last time, Jay, both the U.S. government and our good friend George Soros was heavily involved in trying to overthrow the Macedonian government, and most likely in response to Macedonia agreeing to be part of the Turkish Stream pipeline.
Yeah.
Which, Turkey signed with Russia after the South Stream failed over U.S. pressure against Bulgaria. The U.S. doesn't want Russia to be able to sell its gas to Western Europe.
Absolutely. We have to keep the petrodollar strong. We need those markets. We need a bid under the dollar, so that's why.
And we need to overthrow Russia. So Macedonia agreed for this Turkish Stream, and very quickly thereafter, the U.S. really ramped up the regime change machine. And whatever the reason, the current Macedonian government went into negotiations with the opposition. Essentially, I'd say at this point they've capitulated.
Yeah.
They've agreed to early elections. They've agreed to share power, and they sort of back down, which in a way is a betrayal of the vote. In extent, I mean, it's not really our business, but so yeah, as far as I can see right now, they've backed down.
So now I suppose that our NGOs will be in there trying to get the right person in power in Macedonia, so we can block Putin.
Oh, they've been there. We also did a Liberty report with Dr. Paul on this issue, and we even showed on the screen the NGOs. You scroll down to the bottom of the main NGOs in Macedonia, and there's a symbol of the U.S. Embassy. It says, funded and supported by the U.S. Embassy in Skopje, Macedonia. Huh. So they're not even hiding it. These NGOs are funded by the U.S. government, and they're doing the U.S. government's bidding. It really is like a shadow government that the U.S. forms by backing these NGOs.
And the American people don't have a single clue about that. People are totally unaware of these nasty things we're doing overseas. It's just, it's incredible.
When you think about the idea of an NGO, it has a good connotation. Oh, this is a do-gooder group and everything. But the thing is, they have no democratic mandate. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, they have no real stake in society because they're self-appointed guardians. They don't have any democratic legitimacy. So if a foreign government can get a hold of an NGO and fund it, it has the patina of a nice, good organization working for good things.
Sure.
But it doesn't have the backing of the people. On the contrary.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has. Usually, they have a nice name that sounds like it's really a good thing.
That's true.
It sounds like it's really something that's just absolutely consistent with the basic beliefs that we were given by our founding fathers. But when exactly the opposite is the case. Yeah. I have to ask you, Daniel, because Macedonia is, I believe, on the border there of Turkey, and I see that that Turkish pipeline, the ruler, the head guy in Turkey, what's his?
Erdogan, yeah.
Yes, he's apparently lost a lot of power, political power. Do you think there's been some fooling around there by our NGOs to try to loosen his grip, and because he's agreed to this with Putin, right? The pipeline.
He did have an agreement, and I'm not sure if that was a factor in his. It wasn't a defeat because they're still the largest party.
Yes.
But they won't be able to rule without coming into a coalition. And as a matter of fact, the other parties have already indicated that they're not very enthusiastic about entering a coalition with him. So there may either have to be another round of elections, or there might even be a coalition of minority parties to form a coalition. To be honest, I haven't looked in the past day or two as to where things exactly stand in Turkey. But I know it's a blow to Erdogan, and I think it's for a number of reasons. I'd like to think it's because of his foreign policy, which is a disaster. His foreign policy has been to arm, fund, and protect the jihadists that are going into Syria.
Uh-huh.
But probably a lot of it is domestic concerns too.
Yeah.
It's hard to know, but I hope that foreign policy had something to do with
it. Yeah.
Smackdown that he received.
Mm-hmm. Well, time will tell, perhaps. So Obama seems to be stepping up the war in the Ukraine. He's adding troops to the Ukraine, I guess. There's a commitment there in that regard, I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
But he's also really stepping things up in Iraq, it seems, or at least he's not pulling back. And you mentioned there was an important vote this week in the House in which the House, the representatives failed to really call our president to task with respect to his commitment of troops to Iraq and Syria. Is that right?
Yeah, and this is a typical pattern, as you know, Jay, of the House abrogating its constitutional responsibilities. In this case, it was an interesting parliamentary maneuver that we remember when Dr. Paul was in, that Representative Kucinich at the time used to do it, and a few others. But this was it's a neat little trick. The War Powers Resolution that's passed in the early 70s was supposed to curb the president's ability to send troops overseas. The unintended consequences is really that it's made it easier, and it's also unconstitutional. Nevertheless, it is the law of the land, and there is a provision in the War Powers Resolution that would allow any member of Congress to bring forth a concurrent resolution before the House. It doesn't necessarily have to have the approval of the House leadership, which is how you get around the blocking mechanism.
Sure.
Bring a resolution when the president has committed troops overseas beyond the length permitted in the War Powers Resolution. You can bring a vote saying you either get a declaration of war or an authorization for war, or you have to bring the troops home by a certain date. And so this is what Representatives McGovern from Massachusetts, Walter Jones, who's on the Ron Paul Institute board, and Barbara Lee from California, this is exactly what they did, and they brought a resolution to the floor this past week, and it failed by a pretty large margin. So in essence, what it means really is, as usual, the House of Representatives is absolutely not interested in debating issues such as war and peace and their constitutional obligations.
So basically we're throwing out that part of the Constitution that says that wars need to be must be declared by Congress, and we're just saying to the President, you can be a dictator in foreign policy, whatever you want, Mr. President, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and it's the funny thing is, if they brought the vote up, I think it would pass. I don't have any question that it wouldn't pass, that they wouldn't approve the war. But they don't even want to do that. They don't want to take responsibility for the vote.
Oh.
So this is probably a lot of it's the Republicans. They want to sit back and watch and see what happens, and then if it goes wrong, they can say what an idiot Obama is for doing it wrong, and they won't have to say, well, hey, you voted for it. So there's a lot of that political element to it, but it's also just shows the Congress, just once again giving up its authority, giving up its relevance. And no wonder I think its approval rate is in the single digits or something.
Yeah, it's basically a whorehouse is what it is. I mean, there's no other way around it. I mean, when people are so knowingly dishonest, on the one hand, to try to be something that they're absolutely the opposite of, for the sake of gaining votes. I mean, I saw there was something on your website about, I think maybe something that you wrote about Jeb Bush posturing himself as a peacemaker and criticizing Obama for not bringing about peace. I mean, does anybody really think that Jeb Bush will do what his brother promised in his campaign, to be a smaller, gentler, or I forget the language, but.
Yeah, he said he wasn't peaceful enough, and then he went on, and everything else that he said was all pro-war. Yeah. If you remember, he's the one that got in trouble a few weeks ago saying, I do the war in Iraq, again, just like my brother. Yeah. And not realizing he's so far removed from the sentiment of the people that the backlash was so great, he had to go back and say, well, I was just kidding.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, well, so, I mean, it's just incredible. I can understand why your former boss is probably a lot happier outside of that house of ill repute.
Yeah, now we can just criticize them. But Jay, another thing I forgot to mention. But when they took this vote that week on Syria, it was interesting because Defense Secretary Ashton Carter was before the House Armed Services Committee, and he was complaining that basically we are not able to find anyone over there in Iraq who wants to be recruited to fight against ISIS. They wanted to have 20,000 people to volunteer, and they've only had, I think, some 7,000. They say basically the Iraqis aren't volunteering, and they said the problem in Syria is no one is volunteering to fight with us, and the real problem is we don't have a government partner there that we can work with, which is totally ridiculous because Assad has been fighting ISIS, which has been funded by Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and backed by Israel for a number of years. So but it is interesting that these guys are not interested in fighting Washington's battles over there.
Oh, interesting. Well, it's
So,
the U.S. is the biggest warmongering country, maybe in the history of the world.
yeah, it's up there, I guess.
I mean, who would be worse? I mean, Hitler. That's an overstatement for
But
sure.
thankfully,
But
they only had a
let's say
few years.
within the last century.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we had a Cold War, and you could argue, and I did, that the Soviets were the big, the thing to be feared. But how can we in the United States now be worried about the Soviet or about the Russians or even the Chinese from where we are, except that I suppose it threatens somebody's dominance in different parts of the world. So,
Well, the irony is we pushed the Russia and China together with the sanctions against Russia and the saber rattling against China. Where you talked about the petrodollar earlier, Jane, you're absolutely correct. But in defense of the petrodollar, we're killing the petrodollar.
well, we're killing it in a number of ways. Of course, we're killing it by creating so much of it out of thin air that it is in a sort of a free fall, a self-destruction process, and we're seeing it at the periphery of the Western world now with Greece. And Greece is, where Cyprus was a year or so ago. The money is flowing out of the banks in Greece. People are taking their money out of the banks, and the European Union has to push more money in as fast as it's coming out. Wow. And now, of course, Putin is promising to give some aid to Greece. So we'll see how that plays out. But it seemed interesting. Again, it has to do with Putin trying to sell his gas into the Western world and put a pipeline through Greece. I suspect that the Greek leader is just simply perhaps playing Putin off against the West, hoping to get some more goodies. From I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think you could be right. It's hard to know. I mean, they talked a tough game in their campaign, and once they were elected, they did start backing down. But as you know, Jay, there are a couple of what they call red lines, and that is an increase. The Troika's called for an increase in VAT and a reduction in pensions, and so the lines have been drawn in the sand. Let's see what happens. Interesting.
Well, the financial markets are nervous about it. There's no question about it, and it seems to me that we are nearing a very precarious point in time potentially, and I don't know what the answer is, except if countries could just mind their own business, but I guess that's probably a pipe dream, because throughout history I suppose that's not been the case for the most part.
Yeah.
So, but it was supposed to be the case in our Constitution, and but human beings being what they are. But anyway, Daniel, I think that we should be aware of what our government is doing, and I want to thank you again for helping increase that awareness through your good work there at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, and I hope we can visit again next week.
Thank you very much, Jay. It's great talking to you.